It's time to learn and for me to teach memory. What is the first thing that comes to mind when I say memory? Think about it. Don't think about it anymore. Uh, memory can take memory can take many different forms. Um, for example, so what comes commonly to mind is maybe something you want to do, something that you have done, perhaps a childhood memory. It takes so many different forms, but we often don't consider the more hidden parts of memory, or rather, they're not brought into our conscious. For example, anything that has to do with muscle memory is important and requires memory, like tying a shoe. You have to know how to do the knot, the bow, everything has to do it. Ignore that. That's not important. Or perhaps riding a bike. I know you love being the fastest out of the group, and when you see other people biking, either way, all of these acts can be done through memory, and they're often super important in our life. Its scope and complexity are often overlooked, though, but throughout this whole thing, I'm going to explain to you some of the hidden things that we don't quite recognize. Before we continue, let's try out this brief demo based off the DRM paradigm. Several words will appear in a sequence, and your job is to remember them. You ready? Better be. Here we go. Web, insect, bug, fright, fly, arachnid, crawl, tarantula, poison, bite, animal, ugly, feelers, small, creepy. Now, write down all the words that you remember in any order you like, and as many as you can. Pause if you need more time, and just unpause when you're done. Sure hope you did that, because now for each of the next following words, I want you to describe whether or not you previously saw them on the list. Alright? Here we go. Animal, sky, fright, spider. Similar experiments using this paradigm show that many people, maybe not you, don't want to assume, that a lot of people saw spider or remember or recall seeing spider in the list. It's very fascinating because it shows that memory is a reconstructive process that is complex and just really cool in general. And in the future, or the next little bit, I'm going to explain further how this all works. To start off, I want to start by pointing out some basic terminology that's important towards knowing the rest of the stuff within this unit that I'm going to share. There's some basic terminology includes encoding. This is a whole three-step phase. It starts with encoding, then storage, then retrieval. You can kind of see something that I'll explain in the future here. Don't worry about it too much. I'll explain it. Encoding is when information is first being learned. It is your input that you get, that you take and you try and retain. Storage is taking that information, like I just said, putting it into a storage that helps you remember it for later. That later moment is known as the retrieval point, where we access this prior knowledge that we learned a while back and try to make use of them into the present. This whole step process, I want to explain through an example. An example you might be able to relate to a little bit. I don't know, probably not, but a little bit. Doesn't matter. Let's say you know your route to school that you used to walk with the road that might have probably could have hurt you if cars never stop. Doesn't matter. Let's say there's a new route that is like you've discovered or that is opened that goes towards Elgin. Let's say, ooh, new route, very cool. And you're like, I'm gonna take that because the other one's mean and I don't really like the idea of getting run over by cars all the time. Let's say you got that route. This is a part of your encoding phase because you are learning new landmarks, routes, or spatial cues as you kind of go about taking this route every day for the first time. You recognize new trees, new pathways, new roads, and like sequences to take that you need to do to get to the place that you want to go. But let's say you have to stop taking this new route because of a construction site that's blocking it off entirely. This is super realistic, I know. It's great. This is where your storage comes in play because you have to now retain this information without actually performing any active recall where you practice this. There's no practice effect that helps you retain this. Now, repeating it, there's a point in which you stop remembering it, and now it's just strictly in your memory, your storage. Retrieval is when you try to kind of, let's say the route reopens, and now you have to try and remember all the things that you once learned, but now in the context of the future. Let's say now you're going through it and you're trying to remember, was it this way? Was it that way? Did I see that tree before? Some of the context cues can help you guide it, but perhaps maybe your memory has faded over time. Why has this happened? Well, there's some things that can kind of describe it, but also not really. Its memory in general is a very multifaceted process that we still don't know a lot about, but there's some things that we do know about that we test through the context of experiments and simple procedures. A simple procedure could be this experiment that I'm about to explain that I quite thought was interesting in general. In this one, there was a study phase where a bunch of words were presented, and a retrieval phase where you're supposed to learn them, remember them, and wait a bit of time. Let's say you got 2 minutes to remember this, and then you wait 2 minutes again, and then you have some time to retrieve them and just write down as much as you remember. Similar to what I did with you in the beginning. But in this case, there was two groups. There was group 1 and there was group 2. Group 1 had to do or remember a bizarre image or think of a bizarre image when they were learning these words or trying to remember these words. An example of this could be, I don't know, pants. When they're learning it or when they're reading it, they're envisioning really just interesting pants in general, really, well, bizarre. They're going to create a bizarre image in their mind about pants. I'm going to explain imaging and stuff within sensory memory later, and it'll all kind of tie together, but for the time being, let's just not worry about that in general. Let's say group 1 had to create bizarre images for each of the words that they were reading, and then group 2 just read them silently, as most people would do when they're trying to study for a test or memorize any words, maybe perhaps what you just did at the start. And then there's retention time, storage time. And then during the test or retrieval phase, the results that came out were that group 1, the people that did the bizarre image, actually remembered a lot more in comparison to group 2 that read silently because they did a different type of processing. It was a deeper level that I kind of explained with you yesterday, and I'll go into it more later on. It's not really a word. Figure it out, future me problem. Anyways, the point is there's so many different ways to test this memory, and there's a ton of other experiments that have been done that pick on specific things. In this case, it was the type of learning that you do, but there's some where the amount of time was done, perhaps the amount of words that were learned, the amount of time you had to retrieve stuff, if you had to pick between if they were there or not, similar to what I did with you earlier. Tons of different ways that do it, and it helps us better understand in general how memory works. Another point that I kind of want to go over, or I have to learn in general, are retrieval cues. And retrieval cues are any piece of information that can be used to access other info that is stored in our memory. It's a good example of this is when memory is shaped within conversation. Maybe I'm talking to you, and you're talking about the weather. Back home, it's super raining, it's pouring out. That could create a cue for me to remember about the lake, or the so-called lake that you claim is full of water, which is not, but I digress. Different thing, whole different topic, and I'm right. Anyways, your cue saying how it's raining lots could strike me to remember or retrieve a memory about the pond in general. It's an important little definition there that I want to point out because it helps us navigate through the future content. Sensory and senses and memory builds off sensory memory. Pretty similar, goes hand in hand. Sensory memory is basically the transient maintenance of perceptual and physical info from the very recent past. An example I like to think of this is the Disney logo, where they do ooh, you're watching Disney, and they have all the sparkles that fade behind, and it just disappears very quickly. It's a form of sensory memory because you visualize the words as being hand drawn out, and even though they've disappeared, you can still know they're there. You remember they're there, and then you're processing the next thing goes on. And then when they're done doing that word sequence, you can remember everything that's kind of done in general. Another one is sign language. If I'm trying to say the word apple, let's see if I remember. A-P-P-L-E, that would be apple. You can remember the past, or anyone that knows how to speak sign language knows the past letters were done. They don't need to continuously see them. That's part of sensory memory, which also goes in hand with one of the three types of memory here, which is ionic memory. It's our visual information. It's the Disney logo. It's sign language. It's super important in our day-to-day lives because without it, we wouldn't really be able to process information. The other two are echoic memory and haptic memory. Echoic memory is our auditory information, stuff we hear and stuff that we touch. Haptic is touch, echoic is hear. I think E for ear, ionic for eyes. That's just for memorizing. But all these three are important towards how we interact in our day-to-day lives. It's important. Next topic, how do memories, or how long do memories exist in general? And the answer is it kind of depends. There's no set answer per se because there's so many dependent factors. It's like when the teacher would ask you a question and you're like, well, it depends. You try to sound smart. I don't know if you did. I did that. Doesn't matter. I'm saying too much. There's lots of what we know that mostly comes off of studies of people, specifically who experience amnesia. People who experience amnesia don't have the same memory traits that we have or properties that we have. And with the comparison between a standard person and a person who experiences amnesia, we can make those comparisons and try and come to conclusions about how memory works in general. A really important person within this whole thing, patient HM. Patient HM, his story was that he had a lot of seizures. Pretty tough, pretty difficult. He experienced a lot of pain. And because of this, he had to undergo surgery. A surgery where he had both sides of his hippocampus removed. So I think it was pretty much all of the hippocampus in general, which affected his memory very differently, but also took away seizures, which is great. He developed, though, through this removal, antegrade amnesia, which basically means that he was in a constant present learning. I think we learned about this in psych in grade 12, but I don't fully remember. Either way, it was a full present living where he could only retain information within minutes, or he can only remember enough to maintain a whole conversation where he doesn't forget what happens. He can keep it going, is what I'm saying. But he couldn't retain anything further than that in general. And he was in a constant present. What's interesting, though, is he was still able to develop skills in general. I think there was one where it was writing behind a mirror. I don't really fully remember how it works. But the point is he was able to develop skills still. Okay, I think I'm finally good. Little update. Someone walked in when I was presenting. It probably cut for now. I don't know. It's been a little bit of time. Got some different clothes on. My computer started tweaking. I don't know. I'm just gonna ease myself back into this. I think I was talking about the hippocampus earlier, somewhere over here. I'm in a different room now, so I don't even know either. But either way, I'm gonna just move on from that, and I'm gonna go to the multi-store model. Yeah, multi-store model, developed by Atkinson and Sheriffson in 1968, and it's now known as the best, just well-known way to divide memory into subsystems. And it's also representing the two memory stores that is pretty well known today, also known as short-term memories and long-term memories. You might know that term. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. Well, either way, you're going to learn that. It all starts in this whole model, multi-store model. It starts with an input. It could be something you're learning or something you're trying to memorize, also learning. I don't know why I mentioned that. It doesn't matter. You go in, you learn it for the first time, and that goes into your short-term memory buffer. This goes with anything you're trying to memorize, learn, repeat, I repeated that again. I'm easing back into this. I'm not gonna, no, actually, you know what? No, I'm not cutting this. I'm gonna keep going, because I've done this over like 3 times. We're just gonna stick with it this time. I'm not doing this again. It starts with an input. Could be anything, like I said. In the context of memorizing with the numbers earlier, what I had back down here, you can use that. Maybe you're trying to memorize a bunch of numbers, 7, for example. Those go in as an input. It goes through your short-term memory, and that short-term memory buffer is something that can be retained on for a little bit of time, but once that time interval is kind of over, you usually end up forgetting it unless you go through a rehearsal phase in which you repeat the exposure of said learning of what you're doing. Okay, we're not going to do the rest of that part of that video. We're just going to move on. We're going to try a simple memory test. And all I want you to do is to try and remember the following numbers that I say. Are you ready? I sure hope so. 5, 7, 5, 4, 1, 9, 8, 2. Can you recall the numbers? Just say them out loud right now. I can totally hear you. Perhaps you were trying to retain the information through active rehearsal, like we were just saying. Almost like a juggler persistently lobbing several objects to prevent them from falling. George Miller found that with most short-term memory tasks, like remembering a random sequence of numbers, people tend to remember 7 plus or minus 2 items, and beyond this load, the demand on short-term memory becomes strained. And so not all of the information can be, therefore, rehearsed. With this all being said, you've probably stopped rehearsing the numbers. Do you still think you can recall them? While organizing into chunks of 7 plus minus 2 may seem not like a lot, it's important to remember that organizing items into meaningful chunks can also help expand our capacity for short-term thinking in general, or memory. An example can be used within Mill's experiment, where he created 2 lists and people tried to remember them the best they could. My question for you is, which of these lists do you think people remember better? No more thinking. List 2. You wanna know why? CBC, FBI, CIA, RIB, they all kind of stand for something or are more recognizable through social norms. We say these terms more often, while this is just a chain of letters that people have to remember. I explained with you yesterday that I used this example in sociology, where I used a bunch of letters, made them stand for something, and it helped me remember stuff better. It was really just using chunking. This term in general is called chunking. It helps improve capacity for the multi-store model, and a better way to kind of explain types of retaining information could be used within the serial position curve. The serial position curve is basically where there was a bunch of participants that were asked to remember a bunch of words. Similar-ish to what I made you do at the start of the video. I hope it's in the start of the video. And it had this graph was the representation of kind of what they remembered. Higher meaning they remembered the word within that sequence, so this would be the first word, and this would be the last words. And then this would be the middle words. The first words were remembered the most because of something known as the primacy effect. The primacy effect is basically, I think we've learned it before, it's when you learn stuff at the start, or you remember stuff better at the start because it's been rehearsed more often. If you have more opportunity to rehearse stuff within your short-term memory, just do ST for that. If you have more time to rehearse it, do it over and over again, because when you're like trying to remember something, you're like CBS, FBI, CBS, FBI, CA, CBS, FBI, CA, RSV, CBS. You're saying CBS the most. I mean, this is in context for words, but you're saying it the most, therefore it has more chance of transferring to long-term memory. This makes all sense, but how does it make sense for the end? You can see on the graph it dips, which makes sense for the middle, but then it goes back up. And the question a lot of people have to usually ask is it makes it. I see that it happens at the end, but why does it happen at the end? Well, it happens at the end because and it's also called the recency effect. Totally didn't forget to say that. Recency effect happens because it is most recent in your memory. If you are memorizing words, the primacy effect right there, those words will be encoded into your long term, and then when you're learning new words, they go at the start of your memorizing process. So when you end your memorizing process, your last thing that you memorize will be most readily available in your memory. Now I want to cover a little bit of the different types of encoding during study phase. So we talked about how short-term works and long-term works, and a little bit in encoding, but there are different types of encoding that do affect the ways we recall items in the future. To start off, there's different levels of processing. I did mention you this briefly, but want to go over it again. There's shallow level, moderate level, and deep effort or level processing. And it's pretty self-explanatory. Shallow level is the least effort because it's shallow, and deep effort is the most effort. But shallow level also you learn the least, and deep effort you learn the most. The more we try and organize and understand the material, the more we often remember and recall during a test or just learning in general. If you try and put more effort into studying through deep effort recall or through deep effort encoding, you will end up remembering more. I don't want to go into that one too much though. I want to talk about environmental cues because those are actually really interesting. Environmental cues are encoded together with memories for items and events, and they can affect later retrieval. What that basically means is if we are in a specific environment learning something and it's in our short-term memory and we try to encode it into our long-term memory, if we at a later time go back to that same place or that same environment, we end up doing better than if we didn't. An example of this was there was a study that was done, I forget who, but that's probably not a big deal, maybe. It's on the test, someone cried, but it's fine. It was when they had scuba divers. It's so odd, I love it. They had scuba divers study a sequence of words to remember. There was a control group who just normally did it. There was a group that was above water or not in water. And then there was a group that was in water while remembering these terms for the first encoding phase. After encoding though, there was a bunch of different sequences that they put these people in, and they tested how much they remembered. So I have a little diagram here that hopefully helps. The recall, this is where they encoded, and then this is where they did the test later. If the people did the test in alternating environments, for example, if someone that studied in a dry environment then did their test in a wet environment, or vice versa, they ended up remembering the least, as you can see here. Whereas if there was people that studied in the same environment and did the test in the same environment, their scores were significantly higher than in comparison. And there's also another study which focused on more cannabis use and studying, so more of a mental state rather than an environmental state, because that also leaves an impact. They did the same thing, similar thing, where they had some people smoke cannabis while studying, some people didn't. And then they later had a recall event where they either did smoke cannabis or they didn't smoke cannabis. It was also not just not smoking cannabis at all, it was a placebo cannabis, so the experiment or the participants within the study wouldn't know. But for the case of explaining, I'm just going to say no. People with that had the alternating, either studied first with placebo and then did cannabis while testing, or studied with cannabis and then did their testing without it. If it was alternating, same thing as the scuba diver thing, lowest marks usually. If you had someone studying with cannabis before and then cannabis again, they did a little bit better. But I know what you're thinking. Don't do that, because it turns out when you don't do none, you have no cannabis while studying and then no cannabis when retrieving. Turns out you remember almost twice as much. So don't do it. this is kind of the last bit. It's all about forgetting. I'm just gonna wrap it up a little quickly. I'm not gonna do as much detail because I am a little bit lazy right now. Just a bit. But that doesn't matter because we're talking about forgetting right now. Forgetting, it happens pretty quickly initially. When we learn something initially, we try to encode something into our memory. It happens and it goes into our short-term memory. But if we don't rehearse it, forgetting happens pretty quickly, where the initial time of rate forgetting happens really quickly. Later on, it's much slower because we've already forgotten most of the details. But there's something called spontaneous recovery, where even after we've forgotten something, our initial rate of learning is much quicker, much quicker, because we've done it in the past. This suggests that there's something called a decay model instead of completely forgetting, because instead of wiping everything out after a specific time immediately, doesn't make much sense. We're kind of deconstructing parts of what we've learned one bit at a time, and relearning is just simply the act, or remembering is simply the act of reconstructing that prior experience. Rather than forgetting, it's more of an interference of stimuli and input. Additionally, we can't say it's just because of time itself. Usually, time makes sense, but usually we're thinking about other things through that time, or doing other things through that time. For example, if I'm learning about a grade class, psychology, and then I go to something like calculus after, that takes a lot of energy, and therefore I'm using those resources. I'm learning about calculus, and that takes over my short-term memory. So whatever I had in my short-term memory before is being removed and replaced with calculus. But if I return to psych another time, it doesn't mean it's completely forgotten. It simply means that our rate of relearning is going to be a lot quicker. Researchers also suggest that forgetting should also be viewed as a loss of access, where only very specific cues call recall. Just because we have so little memory, or we've forgotten a lot, doesn't mean it still can't be recalled. If we use very specific recall techniques, it can be easier to remember certain things that you learned in the past. It's through guidance that helps us remember if we haven't rehearsed in a while. I've talked a little bit about remembering already. But one key thing is it's the act of reconstructing past experiences. Reconstructing is a key word because it's prone to error. So the way you reconstruct things the second time could be a little bit different than the first time. This is a great example with memories. If you think of a past memory you had when you were a kid, it's probably what you explained right now. It's probably so much different than what actually happened, unless you were given backup support by parents or something. It's probably a lot different compared to what you used to see it as, because with the act of remembering, we reconstruct stuff and we create often false spur-ish memories where we still have the general idea, but this very specific details are often altered and incorrect. I think that is it for the whole of this unit. There's some things I left out here and there, but I think I got over the gist of it, so yay, I hope this works out okay. I don't know. Yay.